It was 45 degrees Fahrenheit this morning. Winter's coming. I think flying's just about over.
What are you talking about? Winter is some of the best time to fly.
Well, we'll debate the seasonality of flying on this episode of Aviation Intrigue.
This is aviation intrigue.
We'll get back to winter later. Why don't we start with spring? Do you like flying in spring?
Spring can be fun if the weather's good because everyone kind of comes out from the woodwork, starts getting ready for the flying season. And so this is when you see a lot more people outside. But there are some downsides to spring, especially in the Midwest.
Of course, people in Arizona and Florida are now wondering, what is a spring? Every season is the same. It's 90 degrees.
Or actually, in the upper Midwest, people say there is no spring, there is no fall, there's just summer and winter. So sometimes you don't have a transition and it goes from snowy to hot within a matter of a couple of weeks. But as far as spring, a lot of people really like it because it's warmer than it had been all winter. The ice and snow are going away, and that's really what gets people outside.
My biggest problem with spring is that the changing conditions, it's kind of hard to predict. You think it's going to be a nice day and it's not, and it starts as a nice day and it becomes cold again or cloudy.
That's the problem is you could say, okay, I'm going flying tomorrow. I'm going to pull the airplane out of the hangar. And you get up in the morning, run out there, and there's frost on the sidewalk. There's frost on the streets, on the taxiway. Could you explain why that is such a problem with flying?
Well, anytime there is frost or even the thinnest level of ice, if you open up your fridge and then you see this frost forming, it's the same kind of thing. That affects the aerodynamics of the plane, and you really, really should not be flying. So most of us, especially in colder climates, we are used to cleaning the wind surfaces, if not with anything, at least with a towel. Sometimes we spray the kind of fluid that you would spray on your windshield to melt it.
Yeah, that can be a problem because you are actually not allowed to, and it is not safe to fly with any amount of frost on the airframe. It destroys the lift. The airplane, in some cases, may not even take off, which is really bad. So when you pull your airplane out of, let's say, a warmish hangar out into the cold air and there's any moisture, you're suddenly going to have frost in your airplane and you can't go. So like you said, you'll have to wipe it off, spray it down, try to figure out a way, or you're just not going until the sun shines on it later on.
Yeah, I mean, in winter, you kind of expect it. Spring is when it catches you by surprise because you're not expecting the frost in the morning or ice, particularly in places you can't see, like in the landing gear or under the flaps or in the hinges, that kind of stuff.
Not only that, this is the time when people really want to get out there. So it's disappointing when you're going to be delayed for an hour or for the whole day if you have limited time because of frost. And the other thing you can get in the morning during spring is fog. Can you explain why that is bad?
Well, you can see fog can be very thick. And people who live in the coastal climate, like in the Pacific coast, particularly, they call it the marine layer. In the morning, it's not unusual for them to be covered by this thick, dense fog. And some of us who drive, we see this all the time, and the visibility gets poor. Typically, the good news is that it only is a few 100 feet thick, but you got to be very careful because you could be launching exuberantly into a weather that you not really should be flying safely in.
Right. And if you see clouds on the ground or near where you plan to take off, most of us are not going to want that low visibility and it wouldn't be safe to fly. So sometimes you're going to have to wait on that too. And if it's a sunny day, usually a couple hours for the sun coming up is going to cure that. But again, it can be limiting in spring.
On the other side, spring is beautiful because flowers are blooming, birds are chirping, green leaves are coming up again. So it's spectacular time. That's when you want to be in the air.
That's when people get really excited. And if you live in those warm climates, like you mentioned, like Arizona or Florida, it is starting to get a little warmer every day. And you have snowbirds coming back to the Midwest and getting ready. And this is officially treated as the kickoff to flying season in most of the states that have the seasonality.
Yeah, but that poses another threat, which is many pilots, especially those who don't fly regularly, and let's say they pack up during the winter, they're rusty. They have to almost start again to reacquaint themselves with flying because it's easy to forget stuff.
And like I mentioned, a lot of people do not like winter anyway, and they actually do not fly during the winter anytime there's snow on the ground or if the temperatures are below freezing. But we'll get to some of the advantages of flying in the winter.
Yeah, but back to spring, as a glider pilot, not just a powered plane pilot, spring season is one of the best. We get fantastic lifts from fantastic thermals. Some of my longest flights in a glider have been in the springtime because that's when the thermal lift is great. And I'll make sure to put the link to that episode.
So there's a lot of reasons to look forward to flying in the spring, including gliders and powered airplanes, but you just have to be careful with some of the weather hazards that you're going to find out there.
Of course, if you're careful about the weather, make sure you're paying special attention to that. Make sure you're paying special attention to how prepared you are. Go take that rusty pilot or at least a refresher lesson with your friendly certified flight instructor locally. You're going to be in good shape then.
What's your favorite part about spring? Let us know in the comments.
Let's move on to summer and talk about it. That seems to be the most popular time for people to fly, even though there are some ups and downs and pros and cons about summer flying.
The summer can definitely have its downsides, and we'll get into that. But the reason why this is the most favorite season for most people is because it is definitely warm enough. You don't have to worry about heating anything, and the days are longer, and this is where people get their most hours in.
So yeah, the heat is good, but there is a downside to heat. If it gets too hot, like say 90 degrees, the plane performance is going to be affected.
Yeah, we call that high density altitude. So when the air is hot, it is less dense, and that provides fewer air molecules for the airplanes to create lift. And if you ever took off on a hot day versus a cooler day, you'll have a very significant change in the takeoff length and also the landing length. And the climb rates for small airplanes climbing out in the heat are not as good. So you do have to be careful with that.
I bet that is surprising to a lot of people because a lot of people I talk to who are not in aviation don't consider that factor at all. And we go, wait, it's too hot. The plane doesn't perform as much. And that's a very counterintuitive thing because when you're driving in a car, you don't really think about it that way.
No, you definitely don't think about it. And pilots are trained to deal with warmer temperatures and at least account for the changes because maybe they're not going to load the airplane up as heavily because they know that it won't take off and climb as well.
But if the weather is okay, if your airplane is capable of handling it, summer is great. You get to see places. It's nice and clear out there. So the visibility is pretty good. It's a good time to fly.
So summer's when everyone goes on vacation, right? So we talked about road trips in the sky. The June, July, and August months when everyone is out on vacation, that is definitely when the most flight travel happens.
That means that the airspace is probably busy.
The airspace is definitely busier. And we talked about places pilots like to go in the summer, like Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And that is about the busiest airspace that we get in the Midwest year-round, hands down. So it is a popular time of year, but there are a couple of downsides to summer.
The biggest downside I can think of is thunderstorms and just these pop-up storms that tend to pop up completely unannounced, seemingly so.
Sometimes we've had some days where it's forecast to be a beautiful day. You go out flying and all of a sudden ahead you see storms forming and you're thinking, okay, I better land now or I'm going to turn around and go back home, or you're just about to launch and suddenly you check the weather radar and there are storms just popping up out of nowhere because you do have unstable air, especially during the summer with hot air shooting up into the sky that can form weather that is not actually predictable. And so we definitely have to avoid those at all costs.
Yes, pilots, we don't mind being able to predict and knowing what to avoid and how to go around the storms. But when things pop up without prediction, it's kind of hard because you're flying just fine and suddenly there it is, a storm cell in front of you.
Right. And most of us don't have radar for seeing the weather out there in the airplanes, but one advantage of the summertime is usually those are visible from quite a ways off. And there are times when I've had to actually land. One time this summer, it was 10 minutes from home. I was 10 minutes from my home airport. I saw the storms not just coming, but they were too big to fly around. They were growing and growing for miles, heading towards me. And so I just found the nearest airport and landed. And I was literally minutes from home, but I had to wait it out, but it was the safest way to go.
Well, I'm glad you did that because good decision making is part of a pilot training. That's what good pilots do. I've had a similar situation, but opposite of these pop-up storms are these typical squall lines. Can you describe what a squall line is for our viewers?
Squall lines are intense lines of thunderstorms. You can see them very distinctly on weather radar and you can see them coming. They're usually traveling pretty fast, sometimes growing, and that is a huge line that can extend across the country, north to south, hundreds of miles, and there's no way to get through them in a small airplane.
And that's a problem, right? So you can keep going south and south and south. You're still not at the tail end of it. I have actually had to cross it once at least. And typically, you may want to wait. In this particular case, I stopped and waited in an airport for 7 hours. And then towards the evening, the squall line was starting to dissipate, and I was able to find a gap. You have to be very careful because you do not want to be anywhere closer than maybe 25 miles from these storms. But even then, Elaine, I had to land in an airport 20 minutes from the intended destination. That's the way summer flying is sometimes.
Yep, that is definitely one of the downsides to summer, but usually you can plan around them, fly around them, and if not, you know where to land. The other downside to summer is it can be really hot and really hazy. So sometimes it's not the best time maybe to take people up in the airplane because you'll get summer bumps with the turbulence. People are hot. Most of these small airplanes do not come with air conditioning. You're just venting into the open air, and it may not be the best time to take people for airplane rides, but usually that's when early in the morning in the summer is best.
Yeah, that's a good point. I almost forgot that if you're flying in big airlines or fancy jets, they are pressurized, they have thermal conditioning and everything else. But most of us fly in little airplanes without air conditioning, without a lot of temperature control, and it can be bumpy. The turbulence in summer, especially if you're kind of getting into storm areas, it could be very bumpy and sometimes downright scary.
And that's why mornings and evenings, when it's actually a little cooler and a little more comfortable and smooth, that's a pretty popular time to fly. So with the long days, that really works in the summer.
Yeah, same thing with rain. I mean, most of us can fly through light rain or moderate rain as long as you have visibility, but extreme rain or severe rain, you just do not want to be doing that because that could also affect the performance of the airplanes.
Definitely. And it's usually not the most fun time to fly when it's raining, and you definitely don't want that to build into a thunderstorm anyway. And like you said, you keep a safe distance from those.
So clearly, summer is neither perfect nor it is imperfect. So I'm curious to know what people think about flying in particular during the summer months.
And have you ever seen a cool thunderstorm from the air? Tell us in the comments. So it's only early September, and I mentioned that fall is already here because in the upper Midwest, we've already had temperatures very close to frost and freeze, about mid 40s in the mornings. And that has delayed flying in some cases because it was too cold and you don't have engine preheat on because you didn't plan on it the night before. That's going to delay a flight.
Yeah, you see my sweater? I can't believe I'm already wearing sweater in just early September, but that's the price you pay for living in the Midwest. But you're right about the plane preparation. Many people put their planes in these hangars, which are not necessarily heated, at least the heat is not turned on. So fall can catch you off guard because it may actually be colder for the engine and the airplane than you think it is.
Yeah, these engines are going to run on oil, and when it's cold, it's like warming up your car in the winter. Think about you're getting that oil warmed up, running a little bit more smoothly through the engine. And with aircraft engines, that's a little bit more critical. So some people will plug in little engine heaters that can actually add a little bit of trickle heat through the night through an electrical outlet to get those engines nice and warm by the time you get there in the morning, especially when it's below 50, 40 degrees.
And if you don't have an engine heater that you can plug in, there are these blowers, heated blowers, typically propane heaters, that you put underneath the cowl and preheat the engine, preheat the oil, like you said, and maybe even preheat a little bit of a cabin because the cabin may be colder than you would like.
Yes, and there are heat switches that work a lot like your car. So when you're running the engine, you can turn on little vents that'll draw hot air from the engine to warm the cabin. So unlike not having air conditioning, you do have pretty good heat. But some people might be saying, "What? You have to heat up your airplane engine before you go flying? That doesn't sound really safe." Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so like anything else, these are internal combustion motors, and some of them are fuel injected, some of them are carbureted, and it's very important to maintain the temperature of the oil, temperature of the engine within the parameters that the manufacturers are specifying. Otherwise, you could be running into, at the best case, making the engine be less reliable. Worst case, something bad could happen in flight. You really don't want that.
So if you decide that you're going to take off in a really cold engine with hard, solid oil that has been sitting there for days, that could cause an engine problem.
Yeah, don't do that. Many of us do something we call as run up, or all of us should be doing that, which is run the engine up to a higher RPM before we take off. In the fall, in the winter, and maybe even early spring, you may want to make sure that your oil temperature, your water temperature, your engine temperature and pressure all build up and are in the green, as we call it, in the parameter before you ever take off.
And definitely, I've already used engine preheat in my hangar. It has been so cold at night. And if I'm planning to fly in the morning, I'm plugging in that little outlet that's in the engine that adds that little trickle heat. The problem is that takes several hours to get the oil warm enough. So you have to think about it the day before. But the good part of that is I got to fly on a beautiful fall day. Can you talk about the weather and the sights in the fall? This is a really good time of year.
Yeah, we talked about how hot days make the engine perform worse. The opposite is true when it's cooler. The engines actually like when it's cooler air. You mentioned density altitude. In the winter and in fall, the density altitude is lower. So the engines actually do very well. And plus, in most of the country, fall foliage is amazing. So like here in the upper Midwest, or if you live near good foliage areas, you can fly over this in September. Early October is a fantastic time because you get to see fall foliage from a completely different perspective, and most often it is spectacular.
Yes, fall color sightseeing is a really popular time to get airplane rides because you can fly for just a few minutes out and all of a sudden you see all the fall colors before you. And if you can hit those peak times, which will go from north to south as the fall progresses, you can really time it right to get some absolutely spectacular scenery. So this is definitely a favorite time for a ride.
Yeah, and I think maybe fall could be considered sort of the best in case. It's neither too hot to worry about density altitude, nor too cold to worry about freezing in the cabin. So I think this isn't this your favorite time to fly?
I only have about 1 month that I would say it hits all the happy mediums. And if that month happens to not be too rainy, not be too cloudy or foggy or frosty, because now it's that time of year where we have to watch for those things, you can get some really good days out of it.
And just like we talked about in spring, because of the changing conditions, you got to be extra careful in reading the weather because, first of all, you should have a good forecast. Second of all, you have to assume that the forecast may not actually be materializing. We think it's going to be a cloudy day, it's not. We think it's going to be a warmer day, it's not. And that's the way it is.
Yes, and sometimes you can get a whole week of very stable weather in the fall, like we're having this week actually, and that makes a little bit more predictable. So even though you're checking temperatures and cloud cover and visibility, chance of rain every day, sometimes you can get a stretch of time where it's really nice out.
And earlier I mentioned about flying gliders in spring. Fall can also be spectacular. Not only the scenery is beautiful, but sometimes the changing weather can give rise to these thermals that you can stay longer in the air for.
And it's not so hot with that bubble canopy and the sun coming down on you because that can be pretty warm in the summer.
In the comments, let us know. Do you drive to look at fall colors? Have you ever been in an airplane looking through fall foliage?
Gopal, we're finally at your favorite season to fly. Why is it that you like flying in the winter when nobody else does?
Maybe I'm a weirdo?
Maybe.
Shh. Seriously, I think winter is great because of what I mentioned earlier. The engines love flying in colder weather. So the performance is great. You mentioned earlier, Elaine, about density altitude, that when you're taking off in a very hot day, you have to assume that the takeoff is going to feel like forever. It's going to take a while before the plane takes off, and it takes a long time to climb. In the winter, it's opposite. You're going to take off very quickly and climb very quickly. So the performance is great. I love that.
Yeah, but there's ice and snow and it's cold. I mean, that's why people don't like flying in the winter.
Yeah, you're being a Debbie Downer now, aren't you? Yeah, of course we have to deal with ice and snow, but there are ways to deal with this. There are de-icing, anti-icing. We can spray. We can make sure that the surfaces are clean. We can do the preheating that you mentioned. There are precautions you can take. Of course, it takes planning. You can't just simply say, "Oh, I'm going to go fly in 20 minutes." Maybe you can't do that. You have to plan accordingly. But when you do, it's going to be great.
So there are good days in the winter. Is that what you're saying? Because when there's a big snowfall and you get like 3 inches of snow on the ground overnight, how long is it going to take for you to get flying? What do you have to do?
Well, Well, it depends on how fast the snowstorm is. And in many cases, after the storm moves out, there's usually much more pleasant weather behind it for the next day or two or three. It could be really pleasant. It could be very bright blue skies. And yes, it's cold, so wear 2 or 3 layers, but it could be spectacular. And there's nothing like looking at snow-covered field while in the air.
It is pretty cool, but before that, you have to maybe shovel out your taxiway, shovel out your hangar, which might have been iced over in that week that you haven't been there. That could take a while, and you talked about some methods that we all use to get out, but you do have to plan for that extra time along with the heating, and hopefully you've got a good cockpit heater in your airplane as well.
Yeah, so if you fly out of bigger or somewhat busy airports, even small airports that are busy, the airports do a very good job plowing the runways. Most of the time, the runways are plowed, but the taxiways may not be, maybe not all the taxiways. I have a situation where I landed in northern Wisconsin, I think it was in January or February. The taxiways were plowed, and you have to be really careful because they plowed it, but maybe like 15 feet, 20 feet, something like that. So you got to be keeping on the center line of the taxiway. Otherwise, your wings could be clipping. It's not just this that the taxiways are clear, but the snowbanks on both sides could be clipping. So you got to be very careful. And even after they clear it, sometimes there's icy spots, just like on the road. So yes, there are downside to it, clearly.
And like we talked about with frost, you have to make sure there's no snow, no ice on the critical parts of the airplane, like the wings and the control surfaces on the tail. So you do have to be careful, especially if the airplane has been sitting outside. And we can't just turn on the engine warming up and then we can't use an ice scraper to get the ice off the windshields, correct?
Yeah, so in the Midwest or snowy places, it's not a good idea to park the plane outside. If you do, make sure that the surfaces are covered with some sort of cover, canvas, whatever. But putting it in a hangar, especially heated hangar, is even better. But you have to make sure that you clean it. You want to make sure that it's de-iced. But some planes are just not suitable for flying in snow and ice, in which case you may be better off sitting in your living room sipping coffee and catching a TV show.
And that's what a lot of people do. They will take the winter off or sometimes go to a warmer area so that they can get their flying accomplished in the winter months. That's why Florida is a really, really popular place for those of us in the Midwest to get a flying getaway going.
Yeah, that brings us in a big cycle, right? To spring. This is why people get rusty because like where we live in the upper Midwest, it could be 6 months or more of winter of some kind or the other. And if you take that off, that's like literally not flying half the year and you are going to be rusty. So when you get back in spring, you got to make sure that you reacquaint, you retrain because it's easy to forget.
So that's another good reason to maybe keep flying in the winter. And like you said, you really enjoy it.
I do. I'm not sure about people sitting in the back seat because some of the planes, especially older planes, maybe the seal of the door is not great, so it gets a little drafty. In the front seat, I'm pretty comfy. So, I can't complain. I like winter flying.
And there are some spectacular views with a fresh snow on the landscape, with the bare trees and the snow on top of that. Pine trees covered with snow. You can fly over those in the winter on a blue sky day, and it is really, really nice. And like you said, the airplane climbs and flies spectacularly. So there are some upsides to winter flying.
On the other hand, similar to what we talked about with thunderstorms and pop-up thunderstorms during the summer months, snow squalls, blizzard, and if it's blowing snow, that's going to be dangerous. By the way, most of us are fine flying through snow because it doesn't usually stick to your airplane. But when it becomes icy, so the particular temperature at the altitude you're flying is very critical, because that could affect either positively or negatively how your aerodynamics are with your airplane.
Definitely. Just like light rain, a little light snow that you can see through, and if you still have good visibility, is fine, because you can get snow showers now and then on a blue sky day, and that can be safe.
Exactly. And you could also argue that in summer we talked about turbulence. In winter, most often the skies are quiet and smooth. So that's another reason that if you avoid all the ice and snow, you probably are going to get a smoother ride.
Have you ever been on an airliner as it was being de-iced in the winter? Or have you ever gone flying in a small airplane during the winter and seen a beautiful landscape after a snowfall? Send us your pictures and your stories.
This is Aviation.